Let's turn to Numbers 30, shall we? We are in this book we've been in for quite some time now, a book of obedient hope and great failure. And this morning at chapter 30, we are continuing to contemplate the preparations that are being made for this new generation of Israelites to move into the land of Canaan. There are offerings and sacrifices that were prescribed last week, we saw in 28 and 29, with the resetting of that nation's calendar, you may remember. And today we have further instructions given by God through Moses to his people. Commands that are meant to shape the civic and family living within the nation, to shape these things with integrity and honour. These things are important, especially for families, parents and children, husbands and wives, as they now move into this new land. There are principles, abiding principles that they are to take hold of. And there are things in this chapter that we need to take hold of as well. So I trust we will learn something from them. Let me put some words on the wall for you. Talk in everlasting words and dedicate them all to me. And I will give you all my life. I'm here if you should call to me. Some of you are wondering, what hymn is that? Well, it's not a hymn. Think again. Anyone recognize that? Oh dear, here we go. You think that I don't even mean a single word I say. It's only words, and words are all I have to take your heart away. No one recognised that yet? Some are nodding. Yeah. I hope you recognise, not the remake done by, was it Westlife or Boyzone? I got it mixed up. Not that remake, but the original by the Gibb brothers, Morris, Robin and Barry, the Bee Gee hit Words, 1968, I think, or 69. You think that I don't even mean a single word I say. That's what they sang. And words, our words, and the importance that God places on them is the focus of chapter 30 of Numbers. So here's our first heading, if you like. The importance of words. I want us to see just how seriously God takes our words, our promises, our pledges, the things we affirm. And that's something that is clearly set out for us, the importance that God places on these things right at the very beginning of this chapter. Look at verses 1 and 2 of Numbers 30. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said." Your words are important, they matter, and the things you say count. You know, in times of crisis, men and women, now and in times past, have turned to God, cried out to him in prayer. And many prayers, even in the scriptures, take the form of vows and pledges. Things like, "Oh God, if you help me now, I'll do this or I'll do that. I promise." We make vows and pledges. And as I say, there are many examples of that in the scriptures. But when a crisis has passed and a prayer may have been answered, well, then there's a temptation to forget what you've said, to not think seriously about the vow you made, those serious words that you once uttered. That's the temptation. But the principle that's set out here is that vows ought to be kept. We should take our words seriously. What we say before God matters. I mean, what we say matters, but what we say before God matters the most, I might say. And that's a fundamental thing that you find within the whole Pentateuch, the whole law of God. But here is a restatement, if you like, of laws that have been given before. Last week we saw there was a restatement of laws given. And here again, these aren't new things necessarily. There is a restatement of things God has already commanded. But there's a new generation entering the land of Canaan. There's a need for refreshing on the things God has said. We need refreshment on the things we should know, often. So in this vow making, a promise is given to God. Maybe a promise is made that I will give to you or sacrifice to you, Lord, or I will pledge to abstain from something, Lord. I will not do this. I will give this thing up. These are the pledges and vows that people made. It was a common aspect of their life. And you were meant to keep these things. And here we are in this very specific and real life situation now that Moses is giving these instructions to parents and children and husbands and wives. There are some very real life situations that form the background for what we read here in Numbers 30. And our first point, our main point, if you like, is a very clear and a simple one. If we promise God that we will or will not do something, then we should keep our word. Simple point, very clear. But we should keep our word. I hope all of us recognize the truth that our words really do matter. We are to say what we mean, and we are to do what we say. And that is especially true when we talk to God. Now, there is much instruction about our words given to us in the Scriptures. The Scriptures speak a lot about what we say and how we are to speak. There is a lot in the wisdom literature of our Old Testament, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Listen to this rather long portion of Ecclesiastes 5. Listen to this. Let me read it for you if you can't read it off the wall. Listen carefully. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifices of fools who do not know what they do. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth. So let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. Hear that? And do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God. And that's wise. That's true wisdom. That's well said. And this is something that Jesus took up in his teaching, in particular in the Sermon on the Mount, you may recall. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, warned against making foolish utterances. Inappropriate use of words. He told us not to be those kinds of people. He said your yeses should mean yes, and your no's should mean no. You speak plainly, and you mean the things you plainly say. That's what Jesus advised. That's what Jesus taught, should I say. So I'm quite sure that nobody here, nobody listening, would disagree that a true desire to fulfill what we express to God, a willingness to keep our promises, is right, is good. But listen to this. We need to recognize something else as well. We can be willing in these things. We can be willing, but doing is harder. And that's the problem we wrestle with as human beings. That's the problem we wrestle with as sinful human beings. It's something that even the Apostle Paul wrestled with. He tells us of that in Romans 7, verse 18. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Do you know, we may have the will in what we say, but the doing is tough. We need to acknowledge that before God. Why? Because we need to say, Lord, help me to keep the things I've said. It's not easy. Warren Wiersbe is always helpful. He always gives good advice in his writings. He says this: we all need the wisdom of God in the making of promises and the power of God in keeping them. You need the wisdom of God when you make a promise and the power of God to keep it. Make that a prayer this year. Give me wisdom in what I say and give me power to keep it. Simple prayer. One you can pray. And Wiersbe, actually, writing about this, turns to the Apostle Paul's own words that he wrote to the believers in Philippi. He writes in Philippians 2, verse 13, that they should continue to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. For it's God who works in you to act in order to fulfill his good purposes. So it's the wisdom of God and it's the power of God that we are to look for. We need these things in order to master our sinful desires. You can't do it on your own. You need his wisdom and his strength. If you desire to live a godly life, you need his wisdom and his strength. And we'll be helped a great deal in doing that if we constantly are aware that God hears everything, even your innermost thoughts. But God certainly hears the things you say out loud, and other people do too. The Quakers have a very wise saying on this matter. I think it's worth seeing. The Quakers used to say, of our unspoken words, you are the master. Because you haven't said them. You're in control. Of your spoken words, you are the servant. Of your written words, you are the slave. People writing things on the internet should bear that in mind, should they not? In here, you're the master. Out there, you're the servant of what you've said. If you've written it down, people can read it for years. And it could make you a slave. Watch out. Watch out. And speaking of unspoken words, if you like, here's our second point this morning. A point made very clearly in this chapter is that there is the power of silence. There is power in silence. Here's Psalm 141, verse 3. Set a guard over my mouth. Lord, keep watch over the door of my lips. These are wise words of David. I wish I'd never said that thing. Have you ever said that? You may have said it many times. I wish I'd never said it. You know, there's a great Yorkshireman stereotype that came to mind when I was thinking about this sermon. The sentiment that states, I say what I mean and I mean what I say. That's a Yorkshire saying, perhaps. Now, it's true. We should mean what we say and say what we mean. There is merit in those things. Absolutely, as we've already said. But the Christian is always to be the most balanced person in any room. And it's not always true that we should say whatever is on our mind. We should often be silent when others would speak. Balance, that's the Christian life. So we must also recognize that there is great merit found in often saying nothing rather than in saying anything. And once again, we stand in need of the wisdom of God, don't we? We need discernment in these things and the power of God to prevent us from saying something when we were best to be quiet. But in saying all that, which is true, we need to recognize that silence can also have negative outcomes. Silence can be positive. But silence, as we see in Numbers 30, can also be negative at times. And we need to weigh the importance and the consequences of, yes, speaking, but also saying nothing on occasions. Because things aren't always necessarily as straightforward as we might like them to be in life. Now, naturally, the Bible commends the guarding of our lips against speaking falsely, yes, maliciously, discourteously, dangerously. We would do well to shut our mouths even when we are seriously provoked. It was Mark Twain who famously said, "It's better to keep your mouth closed and let people think you're a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt." That's very wise. But in chapter 30 of Numbers, there is mention of silence being a consenting or approving action. For example, there are references made in verse 4, verse 7, verse 11, and verse 14 of fathers with their daughters and husbands with their wives hearing of vows made and saying nothing. And this, we read, meant that her vows or pledges by which she bound herself will stand. And so, here are some key principles that we need to be aware of that stand out. Note this firstly, that silence, when perhaps we should speak, is really a tacit consent to something said or taking place. Your silence is a consenting action on occasions. We ought to be mindful of this, especially when we find ourselves lamenting how we may have failed to speak up and we regret certain consequences. And note too the belated scenario that's outlined in Numbers 30 of objecting later about something. Now, what we see here in this law-making chapter is that in such a situation, a married woman, for example, was freed of her obligations by the husband renouncing that vow, but because it was not done soon, straight away, immediately, there was a penalty which fell upon him, not her. The vow was removed, but there were consequences. He had to give a sin offering, in fact, because of this. We need to understand here that silence has consequences on occasions. For good, yes, but also for ill, too. And it may affect more than just those who made the vow or the pledge or said something. This is where it gets complex. And we need the wisdom of God again. Now, some of you may be thinking, why does this chapter focus mainly on women? Why does it focus on the vows made by daughters and wives? Why doesn't it cover sons being bound by parental authority, or even older, unmarried women? Well, it's true that this chapter primarily addresses the vows of young girls and of married women. But let's not overlook what I said right at the beginning. Verses 1 and 2 are not for one gendered group. They are for all people. It rightly sets out there that we all have a duty to keep what we say before God. But when it comes to this specific gendered observation in this chapter, we need to understand, with the help perhaps of some commentators who help us see this. One commentator says that such omissions, sons not being specifically mentioned, are typical of ancient Oriental law making. And the biblical documents that we have, they're not comprehensive codes for every scenario. They are collections of laws. And they have interesting or important case points that need to be highlighted and made. And that's often the case when we come to chapters like this that seem to be only going down one street rather than all the streets you could go down. So it would seem that there is a growing need, perhaps, to address specific family dynamics that would now unfold once the people are living in a settled land, in homes of their own. And so here's our third heading that I want us to finish with this morning, and that is, in this chapter we see the position of authority being set out by the Lord. The position of authority. Because the clear teaching of submission is given in this chapter. And by this we can see that God expects an acknowledgement of the presence of authority in life. There are positions of authority given by God that we are to recognize and live by, especially in our homes, especially if we are the people of God who follow him. So here we read of vows that may be cancelled, we note, either by a father or by a woman's husband. And what we note is that these laws are of prime concern. What is being taught here is, when can a woman's vows be seen as being valid, binding? That's what's being addressed here, really. Now, the first case that's brought up is in verses 3 to 5. It concerns young, unmarried girls living at home, those who are subject to their father's authority. What we read there is, if a father hears about a vow that they've made and he says nothing, it's binding. Okay? If he doesn't object, it's binding. But if he objects, the vow must not be carried out. He has the power to cancel it. Verse 5 says, if the father forbids her when he hears about it, none of her vows or pledges by which she bound herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her. See that authority? The Lord and the Father working in that way. And we see that the Lord forgives her. She's not keeping her vow, but he forgives her because her father has opposed it for whatever good reason, we would say. Now, we need to understand that not to fulfill a vow was a serious thing. Deuteronomy 23 verse 21. But what we also need to bear in mind is that we are to obey our parents. Obedience to parents was in the law of God. We need to mesh these things together and work them out properly. Here Jesus, in his own teaching in the Gospels, in Mark chapter 7, talks about how obedience to your parents should always come before any voluntary undertaking or obligation that someone may have made. That doesn't trump the authority that God has set up. We need to understand that. There are positions of authority given by God. And then in verses 6 to 8, we read of how oversight passes from a father to a husband. So we have a second case here dealing with a girl who has made a vow. Now, she's made a vow while in her father's house, but then she marries. She leaves that house and goes to another. If the new husband, her husband, learns of the vow and says nothing, the vow stands. But if he objects immediately, then it's nullified. Now, verse 9 is interesting. Verse 9 deals with a woman who's widowed, has no husband alive, or is divorced. Now, in those days, a widowed woman would return, if the father was alive, to live with her father again, or to one of her sons, if the father had died. But because they've left that home and her husband has died, the father, if she returns there, or the son, they can't nullify those pledges. They stand. So a widow stood by her pledges regardless. Nobody on earth could cancel them. That's an interesting point in verse 9. And then verses 10 to 16, they deal with vows entered into by a married woman after her marriage. So she's married and then she's made vows and pledges whilst married. not before she married, but when she marries. And here we read in these verses of how a husband could veto his wife's vows, as long as he did so immediately when he heard them. If he had objection to them, of course, not just on a whim. But as we've just thought, any silence in this matter, well, that was indicating consent to what she'd vowed. And so if the husband says nothing for a long time, I think the scripture says from day to day, as verse 14 puts it, well, then he's establishing that vow by his silence. It gives consent. However, if he then changes his mind, it's he, not his wife, who must bear the consequences of her wrongdoing. Her wrongdoing is not keeping the vow, because the husband is now stepping in and breaking it. But the wrongdoing penalty is not hers. It's his. So, as we've said, the initial silent approval makes him responsible. It's as if he is breaking the vow, not her. So in this chapter, there are clear implications of these laws about women's vow-making before God. And the fact that a wife has a duty to submit to her husband is seen here as being compatible to a child in the home having a duty to obey her parents. These things are symbiotic. God establishes positions of authority. And here's an important point. Neither wives nor children were to substitute their own self-imposed vows of religious obligations before their God-given duties. This was an important thing. And turning to the New Testament church, their believers kept on practicing the keeping of vows, often ones of fasting perhaps. But we also see in the Gospels how Jesus was very caustic about those who used vows to evade responsibilities to their parents. He highlighted that sin in particular. Oh, I've made this vow to God, I can't look after them. It was a cloak for keeping money that should have gone to help their parents. But people dressed them up in religious clothing, their vows and pledges. Jesus called that out. You have a duty here. Remember Ecclesiastes 5? The sacrifices of fools, pious, self-righteous, religious people. That's the danger that Jesus highlighted in his own teaching. It's helpful for us to note in the New Testament that expectation is there, that children would respect their parents, and that wives would submit to their husbands. Those things are in the New Testament for us, clearly set out. However, there are subtle changes and differences as the New Covenant is revealed to us. If you read on in the New Testament, if you look at Ephesians 5, for example, if you read 1 Peter 3, we see there amongst married couples that there is this need for mutual consenting of certain marital vows between husbands and wives. Consultation and agreement between one another, which isn't necessarily highlighted strongly in the Old Testament for us. But this is worked out for us. And it's in keeping with the rest of the New Testament's teaching on marriage. It contrasts often, quite markedly, to those things we sometimes encounter in the Old Testament. In the New, there is this full, equalizing reciprocity between husband and wife, between couples who are married. So in the New Testament, you get this new picture, if you like. Yes, it reasserts the husband's headship of the family. But in the New Testament, there is this emphasis on the mutual care of husbands for their wives, to love them. Just as Christ has loved the church, you love your wives. And it teaches us this New Testament thought that submission is a duty and also a blessing. Now, the world doesn't understand that. How can something be a duty and a blessing at the same time? The Christian should know that that's possible under God. Friends, in closing, I trust we will all rightly assess the importance of our words, noting the power of our words, what we say, what goes out of you can't come back in. There's power unleashed in what you say. Be aware of that. We should never, any of us, be found speaking lightly about anything. And we should mean what we say, especially here and before God. Your words matter. And listen, if something is wrong, if something's wrong in the sight of God, in the commands of Scripture, don't be silent. When you should speak up, do so. Your silence is consent. Be aware of that. And we need to pray, as I've already said, Lord, give us the wisdom we need to know when to speak, what to say, when we are to do so. And remember the power of God in keeping these things. And also note the power of silence. It can be good, silence, but note those situations when it can be harmful. Husbands, fathers, when you need to say something, say it. And ask for the discernment that's given by the Spirit of God to know these things. In summary then, don't make promises lightly. Weigh your words carefully. Fulfill what you say. Be silent when you should, but when you must, speak up. Because wrong must always be avoided, and right must always be done. Amen.